All right, welcome back everybody to another installment of the online Peace Science Colloquium. If you're tuning in for the first time, I'm Brad Smith. I'm a assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and I run this colloquium with Chelsea Estancona, who's an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. We're an online colloquium affiliated with the Peace Science Society. And so our goal is to bring the great research, the same kind of research that happens at each year's annual meeting of the Peace Science Society to you in your homes or offices or wherever you may be. So today we have a really cool paper that I'm excited to discuss and learn more about called Inclusive Democratization in the Aftermath of Civil Resistance. It's written by Subindra Bogati from the Nepal Peacebuilding Initiative, Titik Firawati from Northern Illinois University, Thurber, also from Northern Illinois University, and Jonathan Pinckney, who's affiliated with the Horizons Project. We have two excellent discussants to give some feedback on the paper. We have Reyko Huang from Texas A&M and Madhav Joshi from Notre Dame. So with that, I think I'll turn it over. I'll turn it over to, I think Jonathan is going to start us off with the presentation. So we'll have a 15 or 20-minute presentation, and then we'll turn it over to the discussants, and then we'll have an open discussion with the rest of our time. So the floor is yours, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. I'm going to share my screen so that y'all can see the presentation. And yeah, I just wanted to say thanks so much for the opportunity to share this with you. As we'll talk about a little bit later on, this paper is in, I would say, still relatively early stages. We've been working on it for a while, but still definitely interested in any and all feedback on the various aspects of it. So to get into the motivation of the paper, I want to start by talking a little bit about Peru. So this picture is from the presidential election in Peru in 1980. This is President Fernando Belaúnde being sworn into office in 1980 for the second time. He had been previously president in the 1950s and 60s and overthrown in a military coup. But in 1979 and 1980, the military government had organized first a constituent assembly that wrote a new democratic constitution, and then organized free and fair elections in 1980. And not only were these elections free and fair, they were followed 5 years later by a peaceful turnover of power in the subsequent 1985 election. This is really, this transition is really a great example of one of the pacted transitions that were really praised in the early democratization literature. Moderates in the regime and opposition come together and put in place the institutions of electoral democracy in what, again, at the time, very much seen as a successful transition. And this change shows up in sort of the measurement of Peru's democracy. So on the left-hand side of this figure here, you can see Peru's polyarchy score from the Varieties of Democracy Project from 1979, so the last year of the military regime, until 1985, that year of the peaceful turnover of power. And the jump here is really quite striking and significant. Peru moves from having a polyarchy score roughly equivalent to the military dictatorship in Sudan at the time, or East Germany under the Stasi, to a score that's close to longstanding democracies like Botswana or India, and not that far off from the scores of highly developed democracies like the United Kingdom. But I want to draw your attention to the contrast between that jump in scores in polyarchy with the four other measures that are also included on this figure. So on VDEM's measure of egalitarian democracy, we actually see a slight decrease from 1979 to 1985. Similarly, on measures of economic inclusion, we see a slight drop from 1979 to 1985. And while there were some improvements for ethnic inclusion and gender-based inclusion, those increases are quite small, quite minimal relative to the massive increase that we see in the polyarchy score. And this is something that we see across a wide variety of political transitions. In the case of Peru, the elite character of this transition and these continuing patterns of exclusion, give rise just at the moment that this transition is starting, as many folks in the peace science community know well, to the shining path insurgency that draws on these patterns of exclusion to gain political support. Now, what this example illustrates is what I think is a broader critique of the democratization literature for focusing too much on these de jure measures of democracy like free and fair elections, And dramatic increases in these measures can mask enduring political challenges related to historical exclusion. I mean, as we all know well, even in advanced democracies like the United States, legal institutions of democracy often fail to translate to inclusion for historically excluded groups. And while democracy and inclusion of historically excluded groups certainly correlate, there's a lot of unexplained variation between the two. So this is really what motivated this particular research project. We wanted to understand, when do political transitions lead to advances in political inclusion for historically excluded groups? And in particular, we were interested in the role that civil resistance might play as a political tool for initiating political transitions that might lead to greater longer-term patterns of political inclusion. So why civil resistance in particular? Well, there are a couple of findings in the growing civil resistance literature that we think kind of make it a likely candidate for improving political inclusion. First, we know from the work of people like Chenoweth and Stephan that civil resistance is a really powerful tool for breaking down authoritarian regimes and initiating political transitions. And from the work of many folks, including myself, we know that civil resistance also leads to higher levels of democracy at the end of political transitions that it initiates. So there seems to be a positive connection between civil resistance and democratization. But the question of whether this connects to inclusion is unresolved in the literature so far. There are ambiguous findings indicating that civil resistance, while it may be effective at breaking down authoritarian regimes, may be more of a weapon of the privileged. It's more difficult for marginalized groups. And existing gains in democracy are really focused on those same kind of macro level de jure improvements on things like freedom of expression and association, not on inclusion. So the question, in the literature thus far is really unresolved. So given these complicating factors, how do we think civil resistance might have a positive impact on inclusion? Well, we focus on three particular mechanisms through which civil resistance as a force initiating political transitions might improve political inclusion for historically excluded groups. The first is this idea of pluralistic values, that civil resistance campaigns are more likely to succeed when they have broad, diverse participation. And this in turn means that successful movements are more likely to be characterized by pluralistic values that welcome diversity, which can then be carried over into new norms in a new political regime. This can also translate into leadership diversity, that civil resistance, more so than other transition mechanisms, is likely to elevate leaders from marginalized communities to positions of influence. They can then use these new positions to advocate for the interests of their historically excluded constituencies. And finally, civil resistance as an initiating force for political transitions is likely to spread more social capital and mobilizing infrastructure. And when marginalized communities have participated in civil resistance campaigns, they can gain the skills and organizing infrastructure to be able to advocate for their interests in the new regime. But of course, there's an important caveat that shapes when these effects to be particularly impactful. This second and third mechanism are only likely to be operable if the marginalized community actually participates in the civil resistance campaign that initiates a political transition. If they don't actually, if those historically excluded groups don't actually participate, then we would expect to see less of this, less of these mechanisms being operative. So this leads us to our two core hypotheses. First, that transitions initiated through civil resistance will lead to regimes with greater inclusion for historically excluded groups. And we focus in particular on three very common dimensions of historical exclusion: gender, ethnicity, and economic class. And we expect that these effects of greater political inclusion in transitions initiated through civil resistance will be particularly operative, particularly impactful, when the marginalized community has themselves participated in the civil resistance campaign that initiated the political transition. So that's kind of our background and our theoretical framework. And to go into how we go about testing this, I'll turn things over to Chance.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Jonathan, and thanks to everyone for attending today. So we take approach analyzing this by looking at a global cross-national quantitative analysis. In terms of our units of analysis, we're looking just at the set of transitions to democracy. In order to identify that set of transitions, we look at the work of the tremendous scholar Jonathan Pinckney, who in his book lists 315 transitions. In terms of our independent variables, what we're looking at is we're distinguishing amongst those 315 transitions, which ones are what we'll call civil resistance transitions versus non-civil resistance transitions, where civil resistance transitions are defined as ones in which there was a major protest movement that played an instrumental role in precipitating the transition to democracy. Again, that distinction comes from the work of Jonathan Pinckney. And we compare that to the basket of all other types of transitions to democracy. The vast majority of those are the type of elite-led pacted transitions that Jonathan described earlier, in citing Peru as an example. I think there's like a small subset within there of 5 to 7 that were precipitated by some type of armed conflict. The second thing that we look at as part of our secondary analysis are different dimensions of diverse participation within the campaign. Whether the campaign was diverse in terms of gender, whether it included participation of women, whether it included participation of marginalized ethnic groups, and whether it included participation by diverse class groups. We take this data from the Chenoweth Shea's NAVCO 2.1 data set for gender and class, and from my own data set for ethnic participation. And in terms of dependent variables, how are we going to measure this kind of complex phenomenon of inclusion? Well, we turn to the VDEM data set that specifically tries to not just measure democracy, but look specifically at try to measure the levels of inclusion, both in the aggregate, there's kind of an egalitarian component index, and in specific ways, measure inclusion along the basis of gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic group. So here's just a descriptive analysis of kind of what that looks like. In total, the non-CRT transitions outnumber the CRTs, 238 to 77. And then if we look across all of these measures, we see that the civil resistance transitions outperformed the non-civil resistance transitions across all of these measures of equality. That is, just to be clear here, what we're looking at for each of these measures of inclusion, we're looking at what the VDEM measure was in the year before the transition, compared to what the measure was 1 year after the transition, and then again 5 years after the transitions. How much did it change? So again, for any type of a democratic transition to a democracy, we're seeing a positive change in inclusion. But those positive changes are larger amongst the set of civil resistance transitions than amongst the set of non-civil resistance transitions. Next slide, Jonathan. All right, so then we'll move from the purely descriptive analysis to regressions that include some important control variables. Two kind of classes of control variables that we use. One related to various forms of time dependency. We'll look at the total level of inclusion before the transition. We'll control for that. We'll also control for kind of the previous trend that we were witnessing in that country over the 5 years preceding that transition, as a kind of our best way to try to separate out what's going on as in the aftermath of specifically a transition versus what is just a continuation of trends that were already going on in that country before the transition. And then finally, we'll also control for the duration of the transition as well. The way that these transitions are measured is that they can vary in time kind of during the transitional period of usually between kind of 1 and 3 years, though there are some outliers. So we're controlling for how long that transition period is, because again, our measure of the dependent variable is comparing 1 year before the beginning of the transition to 1 year and 5 years after the end of the transition. And then we control for a set of kind of what we might think of as kind of typical structural variables that could potentially be confounding: democracy, GDP, population, as well as level of civil society. And in the figure, oh, sorry, Jonathan, you can go back 1 second because I will talk about the figure there on the right. So this is the a plot of our measures of the coefficients for our primary independent variable. That is the 1, 0, whether the transition was a civil resistance transition as compared to a non-civil resistance transition. And here we see that we have positive and significant effects for across all of our 4 measures of inclusion, kind of hovering around that 0.04 difference. So again, to think of this in the bigger picture, these numbers are varying between 0 and 1 within the VDEM data. It's generally from the descriptive data, we know it's going up in the cases of both civil resistance and non-civil resistance transitions, but it's going up more by about 0.04 in these cases of civil resistance transitions. This is just the 1-year post-transition measure. The 5 years look largely similar. It doesn't seem like there's major things going on between year 1 and year 5 post-transition. All right, now if you could flip the slide for me, Jonathan, that'd be great. Thank you. So here's basically the same thing again, but in terms of predicted outcomes, expected values. Again, where you see clearly here the degree to which both civil resistance and non-civil resistance transitions are producing positive change in terms of inclusion across all 4 measures. Ranging between about 0.07 and 0.125, but we see across each case the civil resistance transitions outperforming the non-civil resistance transitions. Next slide. It's really hard to think of what these 0 to 1 VDEM inclusion measures mean in real terms. So we tried to look for some concrete examples. And so one way of thinking of this is an increase of 0.04, which is kind of that medium benchmark that all of the marginal effects for civil resistance as opposed to non-civil resistance seem to hover around, is equivalent to Nepal's improvement on the gender inclusion index following the legalization of abortion in 1999. So we can think of these civil resistance transitions as creating greater progress towards inclusion on the measure of a significant piece of legislation that provides a meaningful right to one of these marginalized groups, in this case with abortion, thinking in terms of gender-based inclusion. Next slide. All right, now we'll look at kind of the second half of our theoretical thinking, which is within that set of civil resistance transitions, we're expecting to see a difference between civil resistance transitions that include participation from each of these relevant marginalized categories versus those that did not. So again, we're going to move away from the simple civil resistance transition versus not. We're only going to look at that subset of civil resistance transitions because they're the only ones that have participation in a way that we can measure, because that need to be protests in the streets that we're looking at. And we're going to compare this on the basis of whether we saw participation in terms of gender. We get that from the NAVCO data set. Whether we see diverse participation in terms of class, we get that from the NAVCO data set. Both of those are just coded dichotomously, 1 or 0, whether the campaign is diverse along that dimension or not. And then for ethnicity, we turn to a previous data set that I've collected that looks at the ethnic composition of these campaigns, because we're not just looking at whether they're ethnically diverse, but specifically whether marginalized ethnic groups, those that are considered excluded in the EPR framework, participated in the campaign. Thinking that the inclusion of the marginalized group along each of these dimensions will be associated with higher levels, greater advances in inclusion across the corresponding dimension of inclusion. And so here again, we see kind of the descriptive breakdowns, and we see results that are largely coincide with what we'd expect, with those that featured the participation outperforming those that did not feature participation from those groups along the relevant dimensions. I will particularly highlight the ethnic dimension. One, I think our data is somewhat strongest here in that we have a more balanced division between campaigns that included marginalized groups versus those that did not, as well as there is, I think, a strong conventional wisdom to think that these campaigns don't produce advances in inclusion. And here we really see this stronger performance for campaigns that include participation by marginalized groups being associated with greater advances in ethnic inclusion in the aftermath of the campaign. Next slide. And here again, we do regression models in the same style that we did before. I'm just going to show the expected values here. Here we see kind of the pattern that we expect with both along the gender and class dimensions, those civil resistance transitions that did not feature the participation of the relevant marginalized group basically performed no differently than the non-civil resistance transitions. It's really the civil resistance transitions that included minority participation where we see this added marginal gain in terms of inclusion. The one exception, kind of strangely here, is actually the ethnicity, where again, we do see civil resistance transitions that include marginalized groups outperforming, but the difference between that and the ones that don't include marginalized groups isn't statistically significant. And even the ones that don't include participation by marginalized groups do seem to outperform the non-civil resistance transitions. Next slide. So in conclusion, we find that civil resistance transitions do appear to be associated with increases in inclusion, even compared to other types of democratic transitions. And I think this highlights, again, the importance of why thinking specifically about this type of democratic transition is important, as well as kind of cuts against a certain vein of critique of civil resistance, thinking that, as Jonathan was describing, it is a weapon of the privileged, something that changes the names on the doors of the bureaucrats in office, but doesn't lead to meaningful social change. And again, we find that this holds across the dimensions of gender, class, and ethnicity, and that the participation of women and diverse classes are associated with gender and socioeconomic inclusion, that we had this kind of funny quirk where we thought this, where it did seem to matter for ethnicity, but not to the degree that we thought with non-ethnically diverse campaigns still performing relatively well in terms of future advances in inclusion. So that concludes our presentation. And yeah, we look forward to feedback from our discussants as well as the attendees here today.
Okay. Thanks, Jonathan and Jess, for the presentation. So before I turn the floor over to the discussants, we usually like to get just like a quick sort of like comment on where you are with the project, like, you know, to sort of help frame the discussion and help us to give you like feedback in the way that would be the most useful. So I don't know if Jonathan or Ches or whoever wants to take that, but just say a few words about.
I'll start off. I think Jonathan kind of mentioned this before. I think something that we've been working on a long time, especially in terms of these specific findings, but also something that we could see taking in numerous future directions. I think to reveal our underlying insecurities about the project, I think one is kind of thinking about the motivation and this distinction between inclusion and democracy. To what degree are these concepts really distinct? That framed, I think, the way that Jonathan presented it at the beginning to try to kind of hammer this home in concrete terms. But then also how that might be reflected in some of the empirics as well, both how these things are measured, especially in the VDEM context of surveys, as well as I think we're well aware that whether protests occur, what form of a transition takes is highly endogenous to other things that are going on in the society. And we've tried to deal with that the best we can, but advice on how we could further deal with that, as well as how to frame what we have in the context of knowing that there are known unknowns in terms of endogenous forces at play, would be well appreciated.
Awesome. Thanks for that contextualization. So I'm going to turn it over now to our discussants, and I'll ask each of you to take 10 minutes or so, sort of hit the high points of your discussion. We'll collect all those comments, and then that'll probably leave us with about 20 minutes, and then we'll have sort of a back and forth. So Reyko, the floor is yours if you want to get us started.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. I really enjoyed the paper. I think it's really thoughtfully done. I was convinced by both the theory and the empirics. I think it's a very strong paper. And I look forward to seeing this further developed and published, I think, relatively quickly. I think it's great promise. So I'll start with the framing and the premise of the paper. Ches just mentioned he wasn't sure whether that premise of distinction between democratization writ large and inclusion is really there. I thought it was there. I was sold on the premise. I think what you are saying is sure, civil resistance leads to democratization, but what about these aspects of democratization that we really often do care about, but don't see captured in existing scholarship, and that is addressing the more, the deeper structures of marginalization, I think, as you call it. What about these marginalized communities? Are they actually enjoying the benefits of any democratization process? I think this is a fantastic and really important question. And so I was, again, sold on this framework. I thought that it had a really great start motivating the rest of the paper. And I was thinking about this a little bit more and thinking how in the existing literature, going by your presentation of it, you argue that there's an overwhelming focus on the de jure aspects of democratization or the institutional aspects of democratization. And I think this is, one of those research areas where much of the existing scholarship has been driven by the data availability, and particularly probably the kind of the hegemonic dominance of polity measures for a very long time. And if you think about science being, driven by questions and puzzles that we care about and that are important to us, rather than being driven by, what kinds of data sets are available off the shelf, I think that you really hit on an important point here in saying, well, this is an important gap, and you are moving, the literature clearly forward on this front. I really appreciated also the very effective mentions of your, brief illustrative cases, examples throughout the theory, which I think really brought the theory to life throughout the paper. So the paper mentions examples from the US, Nepal, Brazil, Tunisia, and other cases. And I think this is really important. And then these are, in the moments that I was looking for an example, you brought it. And these were not just mentions of cases, but really illustrative examples of the arguments being made. I think I have 3 questions/suggestions for this paper. So let me move on to this. So first, I think the core challenge of the theory is to have a compelling story of the causal mechanisms, linking civil resistance and how that translates into more inclusive regimes. And I think the paper generally does a good job of walking us through these mechanisms, but I think this is one area where you could push a little bit further. And so if we think about civil resistance movements or mobilizers, as you argue, building up their social capital as they do so, and building up their networks and creating an organizational culture and a set of organizational skills and a set of leaders who may then perhaps take up positions in the government in later years, in the post-transition years, how does that then translate into democratization? And so what I see very clearly and compellingly in the paper is the first half of that story. So you make an excellent case for the generative nature of civil resistance campaigns and how they create these things, organizational skills, a set of leaders, and a culture and a norm of inclusion and consensus-based decision-making, as I think is a term that you use. Given that, how does that translate into democratization was the part that I was not exactly super clear about. And I think that further delineation and explanation of how that transition actually happens would be extremely helpful. And here, I thought that one thing that you could perhaps do, and I think was missing in the paper, is to bring in more of the traditional democratization literature on what the elites are thinking and doing in the process of democratization. And I understand that here, some of these elites are going to be the very individuals who may not have been elite previously, but have now joined the group of people who then get to move the political regime forward. But what are the calculations of the elites in power in this process? And so I think this is an opportunity for you to then bring in your theory into conversation with the more elite level theories that are traditionally referenced in the democratization story. Secondly, on the hypotheses. So if I'm thinking about your structure of the data set correctly, so the comparison category here, you're comparing political transitions that were initiated through civil resistance versus those that were not initiated through civil resistance. And then you have more of a 3-part comparison in the second half of the paper. And I wondered here if, on one hand, I think that makes sense. And I think you show very clearly why that empirical analysis makes sense. On the other hand, I was wondering about the importance of where these regimes are coming from. And so if you are an individual in any of these countries, what you care about is, not how you compare to other countries, but how how far you've come along in your own country. And obviously, if you were already, far along on one dimension prior to the transition, you may not improve that much anymore past that. And so what I'm asking is that the correct comparison, or is there a different baseline in which the comparison is what was happening prior to the civil resistance coming into being and prior to the political transition being completed? And I think a broader way to ask this question is, if we're just looking at the absolute measures post-transition on any of these scores or measures, is there some sort of like a universal standard on which we are comparing all of these very disparate cases, or are we comparing apples and oranges in looking just at the final outcome or the final score for these post-transition cases? And so I would love to see a little bit more discussion on this. I understand that you do have a control variable for pre-transition levels of inclusion here, and I suppose that takes care of this somewhat, but that's not the way in which you introduce those pre-transition variables either. And so I would love to see more of your thinking on this, both theoretically and empirically. I think it is a question of both theory and empirical analysis here. And finally, I wondered to what extent your theory or your story is about mobilization generally rather than nonviolent mobilization specifically. And here I'm thinking about works by Ailey Tripp and I think many others who demonstrate that there has been remarkable gains in the inclusion of various populations, including particularly, I think with Tripp's work, particularly women following regime transitions, that follow armed conflicts. And interestingly, I think much of the theorizing is similar here in Tripp pointing to these mobilizational capacities and organizational capacities that people gain by participating in armed movements, whether, they don't have to be combatants, but even in support capacities. And I think, it's easy to see how people would gain organizational skills and social capital in a way, because they're now a part of this network. And even leadership skills through nonviolent or violent and nonviolent forms of contention. So is your story particularly about mobilization through nonviolent means, or is there something more broadly to be said about mobilization writ large, whether violent and nonviolent? And here, I think, you can just say, well, our scope is just the nonviolent civil resistance movement as compared to, other transitions that happen in any other ways. And you said that you have a small subset of cases that are transitions that follow armed conflicts, I believe, in your presentation. But I'm wondering also whether there are cases where, like in Nepal or maybe Liberia, where the civil resistance was kind of part of the armed conflict, and how you deal with those cases. So again, this is both a theoretical question and an empirical question. And I think I will hand it over to Madhav at this point. Thank you again.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Reyko. Madhav, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, for this opportunity to be a discussant in this paper. Overall, I find the paper very interesting, and I think I learned something from here, at least, how civil resistance can improve or make democracy more inclusive. I just gonna go, Reyko, covered quite a lot, that I have here, but I just, gonna go with a few comments on where you see you can do a little bit, improvements in the paper. So I start, actually, I like the way Jonathan presented the paper. He had a Peru case and then demonstrate, what actually happened during and then after the transition, right, in terms of inclusive democracy here. So maybe, starting with the case example helps to understand a little better, in the introduction section, what we are you are actually talking about here in terms of the improvement in democracy indexes here. So, and Reyko covered this a little bit, but this paper starts with the civil resistant transition versus other transition, and just also talk about the basket category, and I think maybe it's a good idea to unpack that a little bit, in the introduction section. And the reason why I say this is for two reasons. One is other transition also find support for democratization, and some are specifically for gender, class, and ethnic inclusion, right? So in particular, I'm thinking about the leftist insurgency or the territorial conflict. The leftist insurgency. You can see significant change in terms of class composition, and then also the territorial conflict, making significant changes in terms of ethnic aspect of that one. Another reason why you would like to unpack the other transition type a little bit is because this is your reference category in the empirical analysis. So it is good to clarify what these other transitions are, so it helps the reader from the outset what we are comparing to here. The second point that I would like to make is specifically about the theory section here, and I like the way it is set up. The three different things that you talk about here: the culture of the pluralism and accommodation of heterogeneous preferences, the diffusion of the skills in organizations that were excluded or marginalized, and then the diverse political leadership that come to power after civil resistance. But as I went through the theory section, and I like the examples that you populate in here and there, and how the mechanism, and to show how the mechanism works. But after reading, going through the theory section, I also felt a little bit like missing factor there about the support from external actors, for the transition itself. And this is particularly because of significant international support on good governance after the transition, right? So, and that sets up, why the external actors can be an important, explanatory factor here to make your theory more cohesive, more, more parsimonious here. And we can see international actors playing significant role. For example, the reason, why Nepal's transition, especially the 90 transition, was successful was because of India's role, the blockade and everything that they did, right? And it may have happened in other countries too. The research path design, I also see a little bit of improvements that you can do there, because the dependent variable is continuous. It makes sense to use the change, because you are not doing the absolute state of inclusiveness in the post-transition phase, right? Because you are saying you are actually looking the impact of civil transition on various indicators. So maybe it's a good idea to use delta or change instead of the absolute value. Reyko mentioned this a little bit. You do have control for the prior transition variable there, and also the prior 5-year trend there. It captures to some degree, but may not be able to capture the all that you otherwise would like to. Another thing that I do have in terms of the research design or empirical analysis is and also Reyko mentioned this about the other transition type. Particularly I'm thinking about cases like in Nepal, South Africa, Liberia, and others. Where the civil resistance actually collided, or I would say came at the very end of the civil war process, right? Maybe there is an interaction effect that you would like to take a look, whether the civil resistance, and then the interaction with other transition type or other processes going on at the same time, jointly determine some of the variations that you would like to know in the dependent variable here. And then the one thing that that it is just the thought that I do have here. Maybe it's a good idea to include variables like whether there were earlier civil resistant transition or not, because you have over 300 cases, and obviously some of the countries have multiple transitions, right? Maybe some of the transition, the effect of some of the transition carries over to the next one too. So I would like to say if that is there, or at least makes a nice research design, and also the duration of civil resistance itself, right? For how long the civil resistance lasted. Maybe that can be one of the indicators of, or at least the things that you would like to like to control in the research design. The final thing that I do have is so the way the setup, for the research design, and then the empirics that you have is, civil resistant versus all other transition type, right? So maybe you can also do 2 or 3 other categories, like civil war transition versus all other type, or maybe late transition versus all other type, and compare the coefficient, like, whether there is like, significant variation or difference, from civil resistant to other transition type. That would make a very nice empirical contribution here. And I think that's all for me now, and I can say more once we start the discussion here. So
Great. I want to thank our discussants for the careful read of the paper and lots of like really constructive comments to talk about. So we've got about 15 minutes left. So I'm gonna step out of the way and just try to keep the trains running on time. And but I'll turn it over. So first, the authors, if you all want to sort of respond to any of the comments, and maybe just pick on a thread, and then we'll spend the rest of our time just having a group discussion. I'll also say it looks like we have a few people in the audience. If any audience members have any feedback for the authors, drop it in the chat, and if there's time, I'll convey it and we can talk about it as a group. And if not, we'll make sure to pass those comments along to them after the session. So I'll turn it over back to the authors.
Chaz, you want to take it first, or shall I?
I'll go first. Just to say, one, I think the thing that really jumped out at me from both Madhav and Reyko's comments was absolutely this idea of unpacking the reference category, being clear about what that looks like theoretically, not just making the argument about why civil resistance transitions improve inclusion, but like why the non-civil resistance transitions wouldn't improve inclusion to the same degree. Why would we expect that? And then I think, yeah, great point about the violent transitions. We kind of cast them to the side, thinking that there were just too few of them to do anything with empirically, which I think that's interesting in and of itself, because I feel like those cases get a lot of attention. Nevertheless, I think we've made a mistake in not thinking about whether that category actually belongs closer to the civil resistance category than it does to the pacted category in terms of our theoretical logic. And then just as a point of clarification, clearly we need to be clear about this in the paper, but our dependent variable is the delta, kind of the before and after, either the 1 or the 5 year. And then what we control for is the absolute before the transition. And then our trend line, which is the average delta over the 5 years leading into the transition. So I wanted to be clear, it's something that we struggled with. So suggestions and feedback on whether that's the right way to do it or how we could do it differently is very well received.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, I mean, thank you so much to both of you, Reyko and Madhav, for really excellent comments, at both kind of kind things about the paper, and then also really great feedback as well. I think, the main thing that I kept going over in my head was, the same thing that Ches just brought up about, I mean, Reyko, the way that you phrased it was, is this about nonviolent mobilization or just mobilization more generally? And so I think both like engaging more with that literature in the paper, as well as like thinking about, disaggregating this residual category of non-civil resistance transitions is going to be an important next step for us. Madhav, I'm glad that you liked the Peru example as well. The reason it's not in the paper is because we just came up with it for this presentation like a couple of weeks ago, because we were thinking about like, okay, like what's a good kind, because we had presented this a couple of times before and didn't really love like the motivating examples. So we were trying to find a better one, and came across this one just by looking at the data and then kind of diving into it a little bit more. And so I'm glad that it struck you well, and I think we will be looking at kind of incorporating maybe this as in the introduction of the paper. I had a couple of questions. So, Madhav, you had brought up kind of the question of international support as well, and I would just be curious, if you think this is something that is primarily something we need to address in theory, or whether it's something that we need to incorporate more into empirics as well. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. And then I think most of the other things that I have noted here, Ches had already brought up. So I think I'll just give that one question.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump on that right away. I think both, right? So in theory, it's just like, the fourth argument that we'll make. Right now you have three different arguments, and then you can add on international support. When the reason why I say this is I'm currently analyzing the peace agreement data coming from Colombia. And I do have, a variable where I would be able to see whether the international actors are on the ground for something to do or not to do. And then that actually contributed, positively to the level of peace accord implementation, right? And then civil resistance case, of course, the international actors would not be on the ground, but there is a lot of moral support, in terms of statements coming from embassies and things like that, right? I don't want you to go through and read, all the, statements coming from the embassies, but you can have like a nice paragraph, one or two examples, how it could happen. And then, in terms of the empirics, I'm actually thinking like, maybe you should be able to find, data on from the USAID or other sources, like, where you have a significant support on good governance, right? Especially after the transition, the good governance meaning like, they are literally trying to address the things that we are trying to address, like, how to make the transition more inclusive, more representative of the women, the marginalized communities, and then the things like that. So yeah, both, right? And it actually makes the paper. Otherwise, you keep talking about all these three factors and all the publications, and there's nothing new. So it brings like, new dimensions to it. It's gonna work very well. That's how I see it.
So we've got about 10 minutes left. I don't know if there's anything else that the authors wanted to follow up on, any other thoughts that we didn't collect from the discussants initially.
I do have one more question that I might raise for the authors, if I may. Another one of my questions is there a reason why you chose to focus just on the 300 plus political transition cases rather than look just at I don't know, some broader sample where you could then look at the impact of civil resistance something, right? Civil resistance versus non-civil resistance occurrence on just democratic reforms in general, other than a radical and drastic cases of political transition specifically, or maybe this is just a neat way to have a clear-cut sample.
Yeah, I think it was kind of that. This was something we wrestled with for quite a bit. What if we just took like all country years and looked at the trends and see if we saw big jumps after civil resistance campaigns versus the baseline civil resistance campaigns versus armed conflicts. And I think that's something that we could definitely do in the future. I think what drew us to this was, in one sense, the simplicity that you just described, as well as we thought that it would be a tough test, that we thought that like comparing to just a baseline was like too easy. Any kind of like big event is probably going to create some type of big jump in a continuous measure like this. And so that by comparing only cases in which something major happened and in which the category is one in which you'd expect some good improvement as well, and to show that there was kind of this even better improvement amongst the case of civil resistance transition, we thought would be like the toughest test of the argument that we could come up with.
All right. So I'll ask, I guess I'll make last call. If there are any more, comments, follow-up questions, anything like that.
Just a quick on the introduction. In the case, Jonathan and says, I actually do a little bit of experiment, when I write the introduction, right? whether focusing on the discussion about the literature actually gives you to the good research question, or the examples like in the Peru, lets you to the good research question. And in this case, the example, I felt like, if I have example, then I would be hooked onto the research question, right? So.
Thanks, Madhav. Yeah, no, that's good to hear. And I feel like I have the same, the same thing going back and forth in different papers. Like, is it better to say like, okay, in the literature we've had like this debate that's been going on, or saying like, in this real world case, here's an interesting empirical puzzle. So glad to hear that feedback.
Okay, if we've collected all the feedback, then I want to thank everybody. Thanks to the authors for a great paper. Thanks to Reyko and Madhav for the excellent discussant comments. Stay tuned. We'll be having another session in a couple of weeks, but that'll come down the pipes if you're on the Peace Science listserv. But other than that, keep a lookout. We'll have our call for papers coming out probably about in the middle of the summer for the fall session. So with that, I want to thank everybody for participating, sharing this really cool research. I look forward to seeing the paper out. All right.
Thank you so much, Brad. Appreciate it.
Yeah. See everyone next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And
Bye.
good luck.